Alright guys, welcome back. In this lecture, we'll be talking about parsing arguments, okay? It's something that I've touched on a little bit previously in the previous video. Remember when I told you that the argument procedure, there is another type of procedure that is not available on the Excel interface, right? On the Excel workbook, and that's the argument procedure, okay? So before we even get on to ByRef and ByVal, are the two ways to parse arguments in Visual Basic application, let's understand why do we parse arguments in the context of Visual Basic application. So the reason is being that as we develop complex VBA applications, some of the variables are not declared in early binding, okay? They're not declared in advance, right? Prior to the code being run. Rather, these codes, right, these variables are being declared in late binding. They're declared in real time. So what generally happens is we want to have a variable that is being declared in real time, and that variable goes into the argument procedure, okay? And then it performs some operation, and then the variable is being returned on to the procedure where we had initially established on with the variables, okay? So in the example of reference, okay, passing by reference and passing by val, right? So in the event of passing reference, we are passing variables, okay? We are passing on variables to the argument procedure, okay? And what happens in ByRef is that the way the ByRef works is that the argument procedure that is being passed, okay, the procedure performs, the argument procedure performs a certain operation that we desire for it to be performed on the variable that is being passed, okay? And then it performs the operation, and then the argument is returned back to the procedure. And what happens when the argument is returned back to the procedure in the case of ByRef is that the value takes on the value that has been modified in the argument procedure, right? So the way we pass arguments by ref is to just pass it by its variable, okay? I know there's several ways to do it, okay? But this is how I generally do it. If I'm passing a variable by ref, I just put on the variable A, B, C, and D, okay? I'm passing A, B, C, D. So this is how I pass it, right? There's no bracket enclosing the variable, okay? Unlike the event of ByVal, okay? So that's what you need to know about ByRef. You're passing an argument and the value changes. The value takes on the value that has been modified in the argument procedure. In the event of ByVal, we're going to pass the argument, okay? So we're going to pass the argument using the bracket enclosure. So you have the variable and then we're going to enclose it with the bracket, okay? So once we've enclosed it with the bracket, Excel or VBA understands that we're passing it by val, okay? So the argument procedure performs some mathematical whatever operations that were desired to be performed, and that variable is returned on back to the standard procedure. And what happens is that the value does not take the value that has been modified or altered in the argument procedure. The value does not change. The value is retained as it is when prior to being the argument being passed on to the argument procedure. Okay, so that's the difference between ByRef and ByVal. So as I've said, as we develop complex applications, variables are not declared in early time; they're declared in late binding, right? So this is why we want to pass arguments by reference and ByVal. All right, okay. So let's get on to some examples. Okay, so I have a workbook opened, and I'm going to insert a module. Okay, now we're going to pass arguments by ref and ByVal. Okay, so just pay attention. Don't worry about the copying the codes because I will be providing them in the attachment, right, in the description. Okay, so I'm just going to have 4 variables declared here. Okay, dim w is long, and then I'm just going to have dim x is long, and then I'm going to dim y is long. Okay, dim z is long, right? So this is a standard procedure that we have been doing all this while, right? So now I just want to have the initial value, okay? The initial value, right? So I'm just going to have this so that we can see it clearer, okay, how the changes are taking place, okay, how the changes are taking place. Debug.print y, debug.print set. Okay, so this is the initial value, and then I'm going to pass this argument. Okay, I'm going to pass the argument. Okay, so I'm going to pass the argument by calling the argument procedure. So in order for us to pass the argument procedure, we need an argument procedure, right? So I'm going to establish another procedure. This is going to be the argument procedure. What I'm going to call this is sub argument ref val. Okay, so the way we establish the argument procedure, so this procedure, the argument procedure is not available in the Excel interface. Okay, you can't view this argument on the Excel interface. Okay, so the way the argument procedure is established is we're going to have the variable that is being passed. So the variable name does not have to take the value of the variable name that has been established in the sub procedure of where we're going to pass the argument. It can be anywhere, any variable, provided that the variable type matches to the variable that is being passed. Okay, so I know that I'm passing a number type of argument, okay, onto the argument procedure. So I could put it as A as long as well, or I could just put it as A as variant. Remember, variant accepts anything, right? So I might as well just put it as variant. So how many variables are we passing onto the argument procedure? We're passing 4 variables. So that's why I'm going to have 4 variables declared. Okay, C as variant, D as variant. Okay, so variant types of variable accepts any type of procedure. Okay, I mean, it accepts any type of variable type. Okay, so now I'm going to pass the argument. I'm going to pass this argument by calling this argument procedure. Okay, so what's the argument procedure name? Call argument underscore ref underscore val. Remember, there's no space when we establish procedure, right? So what are the variables that we are passing? We're passing W, X, Y, and Z, right? Okay, I'd like to pass W, right? I'd like to pass W by value. So if I'm passing by value, I'm going to have bracket enclosure around it, and I'm just going to pass X as reference. I'm going to pass Y as value again. So if I'm passing by value, bracket, and Z, this is going to be by reference. Okay, so and just going to annotate that, right? Just going to write that down. If ByRef, no bracket, okay, around surrounding the variable. If ByVal, bracket enclosure around it, okay, so something like x, right? Okay, this is entirely random. So this is what we're seeing in here. Okay, we have 2 variables that are being passed by val and 2 variables that are being passed by ref. Okay, now to make it even clearer, what I'm going to do is I'm going to call the argument. Okay, I'm going to pass the argument, and after passing the argument, we want to see the values that are returned after passing the argument. Okay, after passing the argument. So for that, I'll have debug.print w, right? Debug. Okay, there's a typo there, right? No worries, we're going to fix that in a second. Debug.print w, debug.print x, debug.print y, and debug.print z. Okay, so we have passed on these arguments, and now we are returning the value back. Okay, we're returning the value back. Okay, so I'm just going to write that we are returning the value of the variable that has been passed on, right? So remember, I told you that we have passed 2 variable by ref and 2 variable by val. Okay, now we're going to do some operation in this argument procedure. So what I'm going to say is that the initial value, okay, the initial value passed, right? The initial value passed, so the initial value that has been passed, okay? So remember, we have, we have to declare some values here, right? We're going to declare W as just maybe 5, X equals to 6, Y equals to 7, and maybe the Z equals to 8, okay? So we have declared a variable, okay, some values assigned to this variable. So what I want to know now is what are the values that have been, the initial value that has been passed onto the argument procedure. Okay, so for that, I'll have debug.print A. Okay, we're not going to use W, X, Y, Z. We're going to use A because now the argument has been passed and it's taking the form of A, B, C, and D. Okay, and then I'm going to have debug.print B, debug.print C, debug.print D. Okay, so the initial value that is passed, what we're going to do now is we're going to do some modification onto the value of the variable. I'm just going to change the A value to 50, right? I'm going to change the A to basically the A, which was W, right? That's the value, the variables that have been passed, right? W is now taking the shape of A. So I'm changing the value of W here, right? So in the form of A is 50, B is just going to be 60, C is 70, right? And D is 80. Remember, I told you that we're passing arguments by ref and by val. Two of them are by ref, and two of them are by val. Okay, so now we have done some modification. Okay, done modification on the variable. Okay, and now what we're going to do is we want to know what are the values. What are the values that have the value after it's been modified in the argument procedure. Okay, right? Remember that. Okay, debug.print A, debug.print B, debug.print C, debug.print D. Okay, all I'm doing is I'm just gonna see if the value that I've modified from the argument that has been passed on, has it actually changed in the argument procedure. Okay, and then we've done that, and what we're going to do now is we're going to go back to the initial procedure, okay, where we passed on the argument onto. Now what we're going to check is the values that are being returned. Okay, that's the value W, X, Y, and Z, right? What are the values? So we've called the arguments, and then we're going to see what are the values that are being returned after the argument has been passed. Okay, so I think that's about it, right? That's about it. Okay, so let's run the code. Okay, so W is 5, X is 6, Y is 7, Z is 8. Okay, initial value, W is just 5. Okay, sure enough. X is 6, Y is 7. Okay, Y is 7, and Z is 8. Okay, Z is 8. Now we're getting on to the stage of passing the argument, or passing the W, X, Y, Z onto the argument procedure. Okay, so we have passed it, and now it's taking the shape of A, B, you see, 6, C is 7, and D is 8. Okay, so the initial value has been passed. A is 5, B 6, C 7, D is 8. Okay, so now we're doing some modification on the W, X, Y, Z, or now it's taking the shape, taking the name of A, B, C, D, right? So we're doing A, B, C, D. We've changed the value. Now what's the value after it's been modified in the argument procedure? A is 50, B is 60, C is 70, D is 80, right? We're ending this up now, all right? So we have passed the argument. The argument has been passed, and now it's being returned back. And now remember, passed 2 of them by reference, 2 of them by val, right? So the ones that have been passed by val have the bracket enclosure around it. Okay, so what do you think we're going to see here? W is 5. Why is W 5? Because it's been passed by value. So the value, the initial value, will be the same with the value that has been passed, right? Despite the modification done, right? So remember, W is 5 initially. So even after it's being returned back, W is still 5. X has been passed by ref. So I would expect the value of X to take the value that has been modified, right? And X is 60. You can see that X is 60. Y was passed by val. So what do you think we're going to see? We are going to see that the value has not been changed, okay? Because it's been passed by val, we have the bracket enclosure around it. And Z, as you would expect, the value would have changed, okay? And sure enough, it's taking the value that's been modified, all right, in the argument procedure, okay? So it's taking value 80 instead of 8, right? Okay, guys, that's about it for passing arguments by ref and by val, okay? So this is, as I've said, something that you should be aware of. You may not use it all the time, but as you're developing complex VBA applications, you're going to interact with events, like for example, worksheet events, right? Where variables are declared in real time for the last row, whatever it is. And then you want to pass the argument into the sub-procedure that performs a modification and have the arguments returned back, right? This is when you might pass arguments either by ref or by val. So this is two important things that you should be aware and familiarize yourself with. Okay, that's about it, guys. I'll see you in the next lecture.